How does one win friends and influence people? Are the rules the same for men and women? Is this about manipulation and persuasion or confidence and sincerity? What can a stereotypically white man from the early 1930s teach us as women and young leaders in 2020 about successful leadership, if anything? These are the questions I grappled with when I chose to read Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. So what's the Dale? I heard about this book for a while, particularly from a male friend of mine who's deep into the self-improvement game like myself. So when the opportunity arose to no longer put off reading this book, I chose to dive in and see if any of the book's insights that resonate with my male friend would resonate with me as well. The context of this book is that it was written by a poor Missouri farm boy turned business, public speaking, and self-improvement guru. It was written in 1936 and has gone on to become a bestseller with 30 plus a million copies sold. It continues to be a classic read in the realm of leadership because it is so accessible, simply, and clearly written. The book is a culmination of insights Carnegie pulled together by studying successful leaders such as Charles Schwab, Ben Franklin, Woodrow Wilson, and he supports them with examples from his and his colleagues' experiences in order to provide better understanding for practical application. By studying what makes these leaders in politics and business most successful, Carnegie arrives at the conclusion that you can influence others' behavior so long as you change your behavior towards that person. Again, ding, ding, ding. You do not need to continue with this presentation. The answer is that you can change others' behavior if you can change your behavior towards them. His advice aligns best with human relationships in the open systems quadrants because it focuses on building relationships, navigating conflict, providing criticism, giving praise, adapting to the needs of others, and persuading others. Interestingly, this book was marketed to businessmen in the 1930s, which I would think meant traditionally white men who were competitive and self-promoting individuals. But it stresses simple and yet a revolutionary perspective of the time that apparently continues to hold truth. The keys to success are kindness, sincere appreciation, and interest in others. He argues that these are the pillars to building essential professional relationships and therefore to building success. The book is divided into 4 sections: fundamental techniques for handling people, 6 ways to make people like you, how to win people to your way of thinking, and how to change people without giving offense or rousing anger. Each of these sections are full of chapters ending with nifty one-sentence takeaways. And in this presentation, I will highlight, comment, and critique a few that stood out the most while reflecting on my own practical usage. So the points that stuck, or the main ideas. 1, making people feel important is important. 2, you need to express appreciation, not criticism. And 3, it is important to turn argument into agreement. First, everybody needs confirmation of their own self-importance. Carnegie writes that people are naturally more concerned with what they need and what they want, as opposed to what you need and what you want. So when this is the case, how can we get what we need and want? From our supervisors, from our colleagues, from a coalition? To do this, he says that we need to make others feel important. So how do we do this? 1, we need to be interested in other people, sincerely, genuinely. He says that we are interested in others when they are interested in us. We can express interest by inviting people to talk about themselves because people like to talk about themselves. Ask them questions about their experience, give them compliments, learn from them. He also says, and something that I'm not great at, is remember and use people's names because a person's name is the sweetest and most important sound in any language. When you use people's names, they feel good and they're more likely to remember you, and they're more likely to be invested in what you are invested in. He also says that to develop the best in a person, you must use appreciation and encouragement. This might seem obvious, but I think it's something that we often forget. He goes on to say that criticism, finding fault, pointing out mistakes, even pointing out when people are wrong, it only leads to resentment, enemies, dislike, and demotivation, and a hurt ego. He says that if you must offer guidance, 1, reflect on your inexperience and approach it with understanding. Like, hey, I remember when I started out, or I tried this out, and, I kept messing this up. I totally get it. He says, call out the mistakes indirectly. Don't make the other person feel stupid. You must admit one's mistakes to form a connection with that person, similar to number one. And interestingly, he also says use and, not but. So when you're giving someone a compliment and you want to head into maybe a critique, you don't say, hey, I noticed that you did a great job on this, but you really fell short on this other aspect. Instead, you can say, hey, I noticed that you did a really great job with this. And I think with a bit more practice in this other element, you can do a great job on this too. He says that expressing appreciation means that there's a higher value, higher sense of importance, and higher sense of motivation for an individual, whether that's your supervisor or your subordinate. He also says that when offering appreciation, you must remember to be hearty in approbation and lavish in praise, and that flattery is a counterweight. The difference between appreciation and flattery, one is sincere and the other is not. This isn't about blowing smoke up people's you-know-whats and just talking the talk. It's about showing a sincere appreciation and interest in other people. One of the last main takeaways that I have is the only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. I don't know about you, but I like to argue. I also like for other people to know when I'm right, so this is difficult for me to swallow. But he raises a good point. He says a person convinced against their will is of the same opinion still, which means that if you're trying to argue with someone and get them to change their mind, they have even more reason to stick with their original opinion because they don't want to be wrong. They don't want to feel unimportant, and they don't want their ego to be hurt. He says that you don't turn a disagreement into an argument. He says don't go with your first instinct, which is usually to be defensive, because it's you at your worst. He advises to control your temper, to really listen, look for areas of agreement, and truly consider the other person's perspective and give time to study it. This can be really difficult to do, but also really critical, because what it allows you to do is actually grow your own perspective while creating a friend as opposed to an opponent. And lastly, one of the things I think is most important is this idea of thanking them for their interests. He says anyone who takes time to disagree with you is actually interested in the same things you are. And because of that, you can find a friend in them, not an enemy. So we talked about the things that I think are pretty good takeaways, even if they are simple. But what about the points that stunk? I do have a few conflicts and critiques that I'm more than willing to share with you. First, this idea of having to appeal to other people by being in their good graces, giving them compliments, making them talk, showing a lot of interest in them, maybe bordering flattery. Is this manipulation or is it influence? In our textbook, it talks about there being a fine line between the two. And I can see very easily how, using Carnegie's advice could very much look like it's manipulation, especially if you're doing these things in order to get people to do what's going to work best for you. Is all of this authentic? I don't know. Because to a degree, it is a little bit of faking it and practicing it until you make it. And so I think that makes it susceptible to critiques that it's more manipulative, at least in the beginning. What are your thoughts? The other thing is, does this advice work with or against women? Showing interest in other people, being very appreciative, taking a back seat, letting other people arrive to the idea instead of, leading them to it or letting them know that it was your idea. These are all very relationship oriented, but arguably passive leadership attributes. And they are often considered more feminine ways of being. They might be strengths or weaknesses that tend to be wielded by women. And that's interesting to consider when the majority of advice given to women in leadership is the opposite. Leadership these days for women says lean in, be more aggressive, speak up. If people are wrong, tell them. Don't let them speak over you. So it's interesting to see that this is the advice Carnegie would give to businessmen in the 1930s. And that's not to say that this advice isn't useful for people these days, but it is very interesting to consider the nuances of this advice and to consider if it has components that are very gendered. So what's my case? Does Carnegie have anything that I should take back with me? Is being a good leader really just as easy as wearing cool glasses like Dale? The point is that I'm kind of wearing cognizant of the nuances in Dale Carnegie's leadership advice, and I recognize that these insights might very well contradict other advice provided, specifically to women. But I chose this book to see how I can nourish and shape my leadership style to be more relationship oriented and diplomatic. Now, I'm not necessarily interested in changing who I am to be passive or avoid argument or to be overly accommodating, which I can see could happen if you dive too far into this advice. But I want to see what practices make me better in my personal and professional life. And I'm willing to experiment with the tips, the tricks, and the reminders he's provided. Because after all, much of this is simple. Treat others well advice. But even if we need to be reminded of this from time to time, that's important to take away. Therefore, my takeaways are to express more appreciation. I really want to use that and not but way of thinking. I want to make sure that I go into things honoring other people's importance and interest because I want to feel important. So I want other people to feel important. And I think this will help me manage upward and outward towards my supervisors, towards my colleagues, towards people who might be working under me one time. And lastly, I really want to employ more tact with disagreement and approach it with respect, not to go with my initial response, which is usually to say that I'm right, to focus on points of agreement instead of causing this kind of us versus them mentality, to consider the other person's perspective, which I'm slowly working on doing, and agreeing just in order to disarm the opponent by making them, a friend and an ally, instead of someone who has to watch their back around me because I'm going to point out that they're wrong. So I ask you, what is the deal with these different tips and leadership advice? Is there anything that Carnegie's offered that you think you could take away? Let me know. I want to know your thoughts. And thank you for listening to this presentation. Bye.